Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on. I Quit Working as a Stylist. Here's One of the Reasons Why, by Fragrant Brilliant. I just wanted to share my creepy experiences with my line of work. I'm a 24-year-old female, and I used to work for a chain salon in a small town in New Mexico when I had one of the most unsettling experiences in my young adult life. For some background, when I started, I would usually have an open-to-close shift for 10 hours, and there would be at least one other person with me on the floor, but sometimes I'd open or close on my own. This happened for a few months till we just didn't have enough people to run the shop, and a lot of time I'd end up doing a full shift on my own, which, as a small young woman working alone for so long till dark, was less than ideal. My parents thought it was a bad idea, but I needed the money. It was during one of my shifts on my own that I had the encounter that I'm sharing today. Earlier that day, it had been pretty busy, and some usuals of mine came in, got a cut, and chatted a bit and then left. However, it was about 11 when a family came in for 3 haircuts. I was planning on taking my break at about 12, so I told all the other clients walking in when my lunch would be over so they weren't standing outside for an hour and a half waiting while I finished this group before I ate. When they first came in, they for sure seemed really out of place. If you've ever been to a small town in New Mexico, you know a majority of the people are tan to brown or Mexican, a few white guys, and a good amount of cowboys. We'd get a few out-of-town people every once in a while, but they would be noticeable. These people, though, they were so out of place that I knew they weren't from around here. They were a white family of 4 with Hawaiian shirts and khaki shorts. But the clothes, when I saw them up more close, after sitting them in my chair, seemed overly clean. They had no wrinkles, no wear and tear, almost as if they got them at a store 3 minutes ago and just cut the tags off. They didn't seem very comfortable in them as I saw the group adjusting their clothes. Their tones and attitudes seemed weird too, like way too cheery and positive than a normal person would be. It's what you'd imagine as a picture-perfect suburban family on Disney Channel would seem like in person, just kind of fake. After checking them in and asking the name and number, they seemed to hesitate before giving me their names, like they just made them up. For the remainder of the story, I'll call the husband H, the wife M, the oldest son T, and the youngest son G. First up was T. He sat down in my chair and told me the haircut he wanted, and it was a simple fade to skin and 2 fingers length on top. During the haircut, he was talking about moving home after graduating college in Canada recently with his family down to our area. He said that they'd been there for about 3 months and liked it a lot. He seemed pretty relaxed. I finished the haircut feeling less on edge. However, when I got to the second son, that's when I started to panic a bit. When I asked him how school was going and made small talk, he mentioned that they were just passing through back home to Kansas and he was starting school late, which confused me since the other son said that they had just moved here. I asked how long they'd been in town, and he mentioned 2 days coming from Nevada and doing a long summer road trip with his family before his brother moved for college in a different state. While this was happening, the other family members made small talk like it was unnatural to do so while the father kept going between his seat and the bathroom. Realizing the kids gave me 2 extremely different stories and not having anyone else to come by for at least 2 hours, I was beginning to panic internally. For a while, I ignored the red flags, and what set me into full fight-or-flight mode was when G asked me, "Is there ever a point in time when you're here by yourself and no one comes to check on you?" My heart sank in my chest. It was a Sunday, and the nail salon next door was closed, and there wasn't another shop to the other side, and I didn't have any other coworkers coming by. I told him I had to get a call and would be right back. Once I got to the back room, I called my mom in a volume just barely enough for them to hear me without being super obvious. I asked her how she was and if we were still on for lunch today in 30 minutes. She was confused since we never made plans, and I kept my upbeat tone and asked if Dad was coming too. When she asked me if something was the matter, I told her in the most casual tone, "Yeah, Mama, everything is just fine, and I was going to be sad if we missed our usual lunch date." At that point, she asked if I was scared, and I said, "Yeah." She said she and my dad would be there in 30 minutes and to keep my phone on. So I said goodbye and went back to finish the haircut. Starting the dad's hair, I needed to make it last 30 minutes for my parents to get there. In talking with the dad, he gave me the same story that T did, but mentioned that they had just signed a lease for a house and got into town 2 weeks ago. Every alarm bell in my body was going off after getting 3 separate stories from this family, and they kept asking me super personal and life questions that I tried avoiding without seeming uncomfortable with it to set them off. Once I finished the cut, I still had 7 minutes till my parents arrived, and I tried talking with the mom. She didn't have much to say, like she wasn't given a script to respond to my questions. She only looked at H for answers. I checked them out. I wrote down their name and number and their descriptions on a sticky note saying the system messed up, and then threw it in the trash on top so I could get it later. They offered to stay in the shop till my parents arrived, as I subtly mentioned in passing to them to not seem obviously nervous, but I kept turning them down saying I had to clean, and that my parents wouldn't be long. But this family wouldn't take no for an answer. Then T asked me if I lived super far away, and if my mom was pretty like me. I was starting to freak out, saying, no, she's 20 years older, and that my dad would be coming too, and he was a big dude. And that was after they kept trying to pry into my life. My mom called and said my dad was walking in to get me. I'd never felt so much relief in my body until that moment. When I pointed out my dad walking in, they all went quiet and left without saying a word. No goodbye. They just stopped smiling and left before my dad could walk in. My father did see them, but asked if I was okay, and I explained what had happened to me when I got into the car. At first, I thought they'd call me overdramatic and paranoid, which I'm pretty used to being called. I do get scared over the tiniest things, so it wasn't like I was unaware that I could be overreacting. However, what set my dad off was the being checked on comment and then leaving without a word after I pointed my dad out. My dad, for reference, is not small by any means. He works for the local PD, and his calves are bigger than my head, and he has a mean resting bitch face to him, so it's not uncommon for him to scare others. After telling them what happened, my dad decided to stay with me for the rest of my shift. After talking to my manager about what happened and telling him my dad had car trouble and would go home with me, I went back to work and everything seemed fine. Once I cleaned up for the night and clocked out, my dad started the car and noticed that my back tire was slashed, and the back of my car was keyed, which was really odd since we used it to go have lunch together, and it was just fine 4 hours prior. So after we put on the spare tire, we decided to take a detour to the PD to get a spare cruiser and take the long way home. To the unsettling family I met that day, I hope we never meet again. I Was Attacked, but I don't remember anything about it, by Morbid Lydia. Let me start by saying the story I am about to share happened almost exactly 4 years ago, and there are a lot of things I don't remember, so some of the information was told to me by others after the fact. That being said, everything is true and really did happen to me. I apologize ahead of the time, as I know it will be quite lengthy. In 2020, during the pandemic, I had just moved into a really cool old second-floor apartment on my town square. It was the first time I think I had ever lived completely alone in my entire life, and I was truly in love with the place. One day in late July, I had left to go shopping and had locked my apartment, something my mother had practically pounded into me from my childhood. I never left my doors and windows unlocked. When I got home from shopping, I noticed a few things weren't where I thought I had left them, and I mentioned this to my cousin Michelle. I told her I thought someone might have been in my apartment when I was gone. And after discussing it with her, we came to the conclusion that I must have just forgotten that I had moved the items myself, and I didn't think about it again. A couple of nights later, I was up watching scary movies until about 2 in the morning, when I decided to get ready for bed. I remember walking into my bathroom to change into PJs and do my nightly routine. That was the last thing I remembered until I woke up the next day. When I got out of bed, I immediately noticed something wrong with the clothes I had on. They were those PJ shorts that had the drawstrings around the waist. I always tied the drawstrings to make them fit, but when I stood up, the drawstrings looked like they had broken. They were still tied and were practically falling off of me. I told myself I must have moved around a lot in my sleep and the string must have snapped or something. I headed to the bathroom for my morning routine. When I walked by my bathroom mirror, I turned to look at myself, and I didn't see anything wrong, but I felt really weird. Out of sorts, I guess you'd say. Even more so than usual after I first wake up. The longer I was awake, the stranger I started to feel. I noticed I had a headache and my vision was kind of blurry. I went to grab my phone from my nightstand to check what time it was, but I guess I had forgotten to charge it before going to bed because my phone was dead. I took my phone to the living room and found the charger and plugged it in. I stood there and waited for my phone to come on, and when it finally did come back on, I was completely shocked to find it was 4 o'clock in the afternoon. This was highly unusual for me because no matter what time I go to bed, I usually wake up around 7 or 8 in the morning. This is when I began feeling slightly panicked. Like I said, this was not normal for me. I began rubbing my face in my hands, and that's when I felt something was wrong with my face. I ran back to the bathroom mirror. This time when I looked into it, I discovered my vision was so blurry that I couldn't even see my face no matter how close I got to the mirror. Everything looked like a dense fog, or like when you take a super hot shower and the mirror fogs over, except that I hadn't run any hot water. That's when I realized something was very, very wrong with me. I was disoriented and confused. I walked back into my living room to check and see if my phone had charged enough so I could call a family member or friend to come over. The phone was only at 5%, but I decided I'd just keep it plugged in and try to call Michelle or my son. I picked the phone up and then stared at it. I couldn't remember how to use my phone to call or text anyone. I knew that I knew how to use my phone, but for some reason I didn't have the ability. I was beginning to get very upset and scared, but most of all frustrated because I knew how to use this phone, but my brain would not register that I did at all. Soon after this, a flood of messages and missed calls came through, and I was finally able to text a friend and told them that I was having some sort of an emergency, and I needed him to contact my sister to get someone to my apartment right away. My sister lives in an independent living facility because she was born with CP and can't walk. She relies on a wheelchair to get around, and I knew she would not be able to physically help me, but could get a hold of my son. I was becoming more confused the longer I was awake. My sister had gotten a hold of my son and he was on his way. I thought I should probably go downstairs to unlock the door to the stairway, but I was feeling so strange and off balance that I sat on the steps and inched my way down. When I unlocked the door, it was already unlocked, and in my confusion I actually locked the door. I went back upstairs the way I went down, by sitting and inching my way back up. Soon I received a call from my son telling me that the door was locked and he couldn't get inside, so I had to repeat the entire process all over again. I opened the door and my son, along with his girlfriend and my 7-month-old granddaughter, took one look at me. My son's eyes widened in shock and he said, "Jesus Christ, Mom, what happened to your face?" I had no idea what he was talking about, so I went back to my bathroom mirror and discovered a horrific sight. I had a goose egg in the middle of my forehead the size of a tennis ball, and my right eye was completely swollen shut, and I had one hell of a black eye. My left eye was partially swollen as well. It certainly explained why I slept for 14 hours straight. All the confusion, my headache, and blurry vision. I informed my son of everything that I had done that I remembered since going to bed the night before, but I did leave out the fact that the drawstring on my shorts had been broken. Michelle also showed up and told me I needed to go to the ER and get checked out, as we kept discovering other injuries on me besides just the goose egg and black eye. I had bruises in the shape of large fingerprints on my upper arms. They weren't my own. I'm tiny, 5 feet tall, and only weigh about 117 pounds. It sort of looked like someone had been standing in front of me, facing me, and had grabbed my arms to shake me or something. Then we noticed I had red marks around both of my wrists and both of my ankles. I also had rug burn type injuries on my shins and knees. I was still very confused, and I had absolutely no memory of what took place in those 14 hours that I had slept. It was just a nothingness, a black hole in my memory, and even when I try to remember now, which I don't force but do think about on occasion. I was taken to our local hospital's ER, which is really nothing more than a glorified Band-Aid station. The nurse practitioner on call kept asking me what had happened, and even though I kept telling her I had no idea, maybe I had fallen or something. She then asked if I was in a relationship with someone, and I informed her that I was single and was not seeing anyone at the time. She didn't believe me and had the nurse call the police. I was confused, so I get why she didn't believe me, but then she said, "Well, if you don't remember what happened, there's not much I can do. But I can tell you with 100% certainty that you did not cause these injuries to yourself. Someone did this to you." The police never came in to talk to me, and I was discharged into the care of Michelle. I couldn't be left alone due to my condition, so it was arranged that I would be staying the night with Michelle and my Aunt Kay. I was told if I started getting nauseous or began vomiting or my confusion and headache got worse to call an ambulance immediately. And that's what ended up happening about 2 hours later. I was horribly dizzy, and I had tried to eat something because by this time it had been over 24 hours since I had eaten anything. They got me something to eat, and I began hallucinating. At first, it was just auditory hallucinations. I was sitting with my aunt on her bed watching TV, when all of a sudden I noticed that the movie we were watching had completely different dialogue that I didn't remember being in that particular movie. Then, the characters in the movie began speaking directly to me. I don't remember what they were saying, and I kept glancing between the TV and to my aunt to see if she was hearing the same thing I was. I was totally aware that I was hallucinating, but I had absolutely no control over it. Then the paranoia started. My daughter called to check on me, and she lives in a different town, and even though I was on the phone with her, I was convinced that she, along with several other family members, were all outside of the house talking about me. That's when I started vomiting, and my cousin called 911. When the ambulance showed up, the police also showed up, and they were talking to my cousin. When they asked me what hospital I wanted to go to, I told them the name, and my cousin, who knew me very well, knew I would never ask to go to that particular hospital. That's a story for another time. However, because I seemed with it enough to the paramedics, and I kept insisting that's where I wanted to go, that's where they had to take me. I now wish that I had listened to my cousin. Because it was incredibly late at night and the hospital I was taken to was 25 minutes away, no one in my family met me at the hospital, and the hospital didn't even try to call my family for information. I don't remember what I did or what I said to anyone after that. I was so confused and hallucinating that it must have been bad, as I was committed to the hospital's psych floor over a traumatic brain injury for 11 days. 11! That's also a story for another time. I still to this day have no recollection of what happened to me, but I really don't want to remember, seeing as all the medical professionals and my own healthcare providers who saw my injuries say that I had to have been attacked by someone. It's scary to think of all the possibilities. Was someone actually hiding in my house that night without me knowing? Could it have been one of the carnival workers I saw walking around the town square earlier that day? Worse yet, was it someone that I knew and still have in my life now? I'm not sure which is worse, not knowing it all or having the memories of it forever. My Friend, My Catfisher by Suspicious Year. When I, now a 32-year-old female, was 13 years old, I met a girl online who was a couple years older than me. We shared a love of anime and quickly became good friends. We chatted on MSN Messenger and soon exchanged phone numbers as well. I fell for her hard, as only a 13-year-old girl can. Now, this is not your typical catfish story. This person was definitely real. I met her in person multiple times in different events. The only problem with this beautiful relationship was that my friend had a lot of problems. She had cancer, she was about to go blind, she'd been gang assaulted, all kinds of messed up things. I tried to help her through the best of my emotional and financial capacity. I know now it's starting to sound more like your typical catfish story. She also had some friends I befriended as well. Her closest friend was a guy, S, who was actually the love of her life. They shared a bond so strong they could sense when the other was in trouble. They totally would have been a love story potential, but it so happened that they were actually half-siblings, and therefore couldn't be together. It was a tragedy, and I was sorry for them, but at least it left the girl available for me. Looking back, the relationship we had was insane. I was codependent on her, and she was super manipulative. Thank goodness I was only a teenager without a job, or I probably would have been the sucker who ends up in massive debt over their catfisher. What little money I ever did have, though, I'd spend on her. I wasn't a complete pushover, or at least I tried not to be. Sometimes I'd question her stories. Sometimes I'd catch wind of her schemes and would try to block her. But then her other friends, especially S, would fly in to come and talk to me and tell me how badly this girl was doing and needed help or support. I'd always go back. She used to berate me for the weirdest things. She'd always find some fault in me to point out. She'd claim I was trying to make her jealous by spending time with other friends. She would tell me horrible things that had happened to her, and when I tried to help her to the best of my abilities, she would fall for me for being too stupid to find good solutions. She had my first kiss, though I tend not to count it because she did it without my consent, and she'd grope me under my clothes despite me saying no. I loved her a lot, but I wasn't ready for that stuff just yet. Need I remind you, I was under the age of 16 for the majority of all this shit. When I'd turn her down, she started telling me about other girls she was seeing who were so hot and whatnot, and we were still talking about getting married someday. I was nearing 17 when this came crashing down. It was a June morning, and a woman called me from a number I didn't know. She told me she was this girl's mother and that my friend had been murdered the previous night. I was devastated and grief-stricken and spent the day crying. Then, in the evening, my friend called me like, "Surprise, I'm alive!" Like, literally, just like that. To this day, I can't even begin to explain how that felt. Just, what the actual fuck? That was it for me. I wanted to cut all ties. I felt so betrayed and officially found the situation too weird. She'd message me and call me and manipulate me to stay. She'd tell me how happy my crying had made her because she now knew how much she meant to me. I can't quite remember how this happened in the end, but after this event, I was just not having it anymore and started questioning everything. Soon enough, I'd found out that she'd been all lies for the entire relationship. I hadn't even been talking with her other friends. They were just her other profiles she'd actually used for catfishing. There was no S, no cancer, no nothing. I'd spent teenage years on nothing but an actual scam. Eventually, when it was all laid bare, I cut all contact. To this day, I don't know if any of it was real, and while this person definitely existed and I spent time with them, did I ever truly know who they were? I don't know. I don't want to know. I'm traumatized. To my old friend, don't ever slide back into my DMs. My Ex Tried to Kill Me by James Playtime. I was 22 at the time this happened. I'm a female and was almost killed by my ex-boyfriend. I'm about 30 now. I'll be changing the names to protect myself. I'll start with a quick backstory. At the time of the attack, I was 19, almost 20. My ex, Gavin, was 27. We had a big chow chow and a cat, the dog being his and the cat mine. We lived in a 3-bedroom house. A few months before, we had allowed a friend to stay with us, Lacey, and it didn't end well as she was just taking advantage of us. The week leading up to the attack, Gavin had just gotten back from a work trip, which was about 3 or 4 weeks away from home. The week he was back, he was completely out of it, not being able to complete a thought. I'd ask or tell him something, and less than 5 minutes later, he'd completely forgotten, or just hadn't heard me, or was just off in some other world. One day, I was very frustrated with this as I'd asked for help with the chores or for him to take the garbage out, only to be ignored. One day, he said that if it continued, he wanted me to slap him. We'd gone out for dinner with his mom 2 days prior to the attack, and she was obviously very worried about him, as there was clearly something wrong. At the time, the only mental disorder he had or was aware of was OCD, in which I'm now even more convinced that it is not what he had by any means. The day of the attack, we'd just gotten back from grabbing some takeout and were sitting on the couch in the living room. I'd been painting my nails and he was playing Mario Kart. He looked over at me and said, "Lacey put a curse on my family." I was dealing with my own really poor mental health at the time, so it wasn't really in a space where I could be forcing on him. I have BPD. I wasn't sure what to do, so I suggested he just hop in a cold shower as it had helped him earlier in the week to just reset a bit. He walked into the bathroom and was muttering to himself, and it just felt so off. I didn't know how to describe it, but I didn't feel safe. I walked over to the door and asked if I could call his mom for him, or maybe invite her over for supper, kind of beating around the bush that I wanted her to come help him. He looked at me and just started yelling that all he needed was me. I walked out and started for the living room. As I was calling his mom, he came out of the bathroom naked and started yelling at Ollie, our dog, to discipline me and attack me. Mind you, he was trained as my guard dog. At that point, I believe his mom had answered the phone and heard what was happening. He started to call me Lacey, and that I needed to pay for what I did. I ran into the bedroom with my phone. His mom was still on the line. He kicked down the door and smashed my head into our mirrored closet doors and then threw my phone to the ground. He was screaming that he was going to kill me. I scrambled out the bedroom door trying to get to the front door. As I was passing the kitchen, he got a hold of me and wrapped his arms around my throat, again saying he was going to kill me. I remember looking over to the table and seeing my cat Sterling all puffed up. I'd never seen him so scared. I was fighting not to go unconscious. I couldn't breathe. I clawed at him, just trying to get his arms off of my throat, and I remember starting to see black specks in my vision and thinking, I'm gonna die. What's he gonna do with my body? He then asked me if I knew what it was like to be raped. And this is the part where I'm not sure if he was actually out of his mind, as I had been raped before, and it was a year that month. I was very open about how that had been affecting me. He threw me to the ground and put his foot over my head as if to stomp on it. This was the only time I had seen his eyes throughout the attack, and they were almost lifeless, his pupils so dilated you could barely see the iris. He was yelling over and over again, "Admit it, Lacey. You know what you did. Admit it." I just started apologizing, doing and saying anything I could do to make him happy. This seemed to work as I got the opportunity to scramble to my feet and race out the door. I just wish I'd left the screen door open. I ran from house to house in nothing but shorts and a sweater in February in one of the coldest provinces in Canada. I got into maybe 2 or 3 houses before I heard Ollie screaming. It's a sound I will never get out of my head. I just dropped to the ground screaming and crying, "Gavin, leave him alone!" I knew he'd killed the dog. At this point, a bunch of the neighbors had heard me and came running to help. An older couple called the police and brought me into their home, not knowing if they were putting their own lives at risk. My parents were living in a completely different province. Someone gave me their phone to call my mom. She was out for supper with some friends, and I just told her that Gavin had killed the dog and tried to kill me. The police finally showed up after what seemed like hours. 5 or 6 cars came, and they had firearms out. They used the megaphone to tell Gavin to come out with his hands up. He walked out naked and covered in blood. Once they had gotten him into a car, a police officer came to talk to me while the others searched the house. Shortly after, an officer came up and asked how many dogs we had. I told him 1 and a cat. I asked if Ollie was still alive, and they told me that he was dead in our bathtub. Gavin had killed him in the living room, then brought him to the bathroom, filled up the tub, and put his body in it. I asked about the cat, and they said they couldn't find him just yet. I was sure he had killed my sweet boy, too. Sterling was the only thing I could think about, and I went into a panic and was no longer able to give them any more information, as I was basically in tunnel vision. I kept saying over and over, "Where's my cat? I want to find my cat. Where's my cat?" The officers asked if there were any treats they could use to coax him out, and where were his hiding spots. They ended up finding Sterling alive, but scared, and they couldn't get to him as he was too scared and kept attacking the officers. They'd blocked off the worst of the scene and had me go in and get Sterling. But as much as they did block off, there was still so much blood, and the smell of blood and feces was overpowering. Sterling was in our bedroom on the bed, just crying. I scooped him up and asked the officers to find my vape. As I was walking out of the house, Gavin's mom had just gotten out of her car. She asked me where Ollie was, and all I could say was, "Gavin killed him." She dropped to the ground and started bawling. I just walked past her and put Sterling in her car and sat in the front, not sure what to do, as I didn't really want to go with her. In that moment, I hated her for what her son did to me and Ollie. To this day, I regret how I acted towards her. I had no right to be so cruel to someone who was now also suffering. My mom had gotten a hold of my aunt that lived a few towns over, so once I was done with the officers, I was to go with her. I went with her. Once the police were done doing whatever it was they were doing in the house, I went back in to get clothes and such. They forgot to close the bathroom door, but luckily I wasn't the one who walked by at first. It was Gavin's mom. The sound she made was horrible. Eventually, my aunt came and I went with her. The next day, I had to go back to the house to get my things. The police had gotten someone to take care of the body, but not the mess of blood and bodily fluids and pee and poop. Half of the stuff, I didn't know what it was. Gavin's mom and sister and I had to clean the house. There was blood everywhere, a lot of broken furniture. His mom was kind enough to clean all of my bathroom things and throw anything out that couldn't be saved. Unfortunately, I had African black soap. That night I washed myself with it, and when I looked down, I was washing myself with a bar of soap caked in Ollie's blood. 2 weeks later, Sterling and I were on a plane to my mom. The court case took 2 years, and I only later found out that at some point Gavin had gone and loaded our guns. For the longest time, I didn't want to know how he killed Ollie, but when going through the evidence, an officer mentioned a baseball bat. Gavin only got 10 months house arrest. To this day, he still tried to contact me, blaming me for not getting him help. I think the worst part is I do partly blame myself, not just for not knowing to get him help, but also for not leaving the door open for the animals, for bringing the baseball bat into the house weeks prior because I was too lazy to walk it to our shed. Thanks for listening to this. I hope maybe I can find someone to relate to so I don't feel so alone in my experience. I know that it's horrible to say, but it's just hard to speak to anyone about it that hasn't been through something somewhat similar. Any advice or comments are welcome. Thanks again. My memory of that day is both a blur and also like I'm reliving it. Gavin, let's never meet again. Someone Was Watching Me by Lumpy Curveballs. I'm an 18-year-old female and I live with my parents on their farm. We have a relatively big house with a nice back patio. We'd gotten a hot tub a while back, which my parents used a lot, and I sometimes joined them. Since I had my own car, my parents had gotten more comfortable with leaving me at the house when they went off for extended periods of time. The longest they'd been gone was about a week, and they kept in contact with me the entire time. I just took care of our animals and chilled out when I wasn't working, and I'd gotten used to being alone. My parents were both raised in farming and ranching families, but I was a city kid until they bought a farm and moved us out there. I'm used to it now, but it took quite a bit of acclimating, considering I'd lived in our previous house for 13 years and knew the city like the back of my hand. You could have placed me anywhere, and I'd have been able to find my way back home one way or another. It had been a few years, and I considered myself well adjusted. Obviously, there's pros and cons, but I'm at peace with where we are now. One thing that took a lot of getting used to was how much space we had. In my old house, my bedroom window lined up with my next-door neighbor's kitchen window, and so my curtains were drawn shut 95% of the time. Now, with my bedroom being on the second floor and our neighbors being 100 or so yards away, I could get changed with the window open and not worry about being seen. I mention this because it's unusual to have anyone walk past our driveway nowadays, as opposed to the city where it was weird when people didn't pass by. Anyway, this took place a few weeks ago, and my parents had gone to a distant cousin's wedding, leaving me at the house to look over the farm. I was fine with that, as I really didn't know said cousin very well. I sent my well wishes with my parents, and we sent constant updates back and forth for the few days that they were gone. Earlier, I'd mentioned that we have a hot tub on our back patio. I believe it was the second or third night, and I'd gotten home from work absolutely exhausted. I decided to relax in the hot tub for a bit to soothe my sore muscles before going to bed. I'm a bit of a night owl, so by the time I'd taken a nap and had dinner, it was around 11 p.m., and the sun had pretty much set. Another one of my favorite things about living on our farm is the lack of light pollution. I can look up and easily see the stars above me, and I've always been into astrology and astronomy. I love stargazing. That was part of the reason I waited so long before going out to the hot tub. I went out and got myself settled, and just sat in the hot water, enjoying the stars and heat, and occasionally sipping my drink I'd brought out with me. It was still light enough that I could see the edge of our property, but dark enough that I could see the stars relatively well. I'd only been out there for about 10 minutes, when suddenly I got a chill down my spine, and it wasn't from the breeze on my heated skin. I felt like I was being watched. Immediately, I snapped out of my daze and turned to where I felt the feeling was coming from. It took my eyes a bit to adjust. I'm nearsighted, but didn't wear my glasses outside. When my eyes did adjust, I felt my stomach drop at what I saw. From the patio, looking straight ahead, you can see our barn, which had some fences connected to it that make up a couple of pens. Our older horses are in the largest pen to the right of the barn, Behind that pen is a large field that stretches to a row of saplings. Behind those saplings is a barbed wire fence which indicated the edge of our property. To the left of the barn was a patch of trees that led into the forest that surrounds our property. Though there's a few divots here and there where we've set up some other farm things, like a garden and a chicken coop. While I couldn't see directly behind the barn, I could see beyond it into the field behind the pens, which is where I spotted what I figured was causing my feeling of unease. A few feet out of the forest, standing between two of the saplings at the edge of our field, was a figure of what I assume was a person, just standing there in the darkness. I immediately knew that was where the feeling was coming from, and I stood up in the hot tub and turned to face the person. For a few moments, I just stood there, looking at them. I don't know if they saw me, but when they didn't move after me staring at them for a solid minute, I decided enough was enough and I got out of the hot tub. I closed everything up as quickly as I could while trying to not look panicked, and then went inside where I immediately turned on all the lights, shut all the windows, and locked all the doors. My dogs had been inside the whole time, none the wiser to the trespasser, and I figured it'd be best if I didn't alert them to what was going on, in case it turned out to be nothing, even though I was pretty sure I was right about what I'd seen. I debated calling the police, but I lived 20 minutes from the nearest town, so by the time they got there, the person would likely have been gone. Besides, it was midnight at that point, and I didn't want to wake any of my neighbors with the commotion authorities would bring. I resolved to sit in the living room with my dogs and keep an eye on the person from inside. Our living room has windows that face outside in the same direction our back door to the patio does, so I could still see the same view from the hot tub, albeit a little bit more difficult with the lights on. But ever since I'd seen the figure, it was impossible to not notice them afterward. The thought crossed my mind to grab my stepdad's rifle from the basement, but I had no idea where he had stored it, or even how to use it, so it was likely not a wise idea, especially because going to get it would mean I'd have to leave my post in the living room and leave the person unsupervised. The more time passed, the more antsy I became. The person was just standing there, not doing anything, in the same position I'd spotted him in, and their apparent lack of motive was unnerving me like nothing else. I resolved that if they didn't leave within the next half hour, I'd call the police because by that point, the person would have been standing there for about an hour, trespassing on our property. More time passed. I stayed in the living room, my phone in hand and dogs at my feet, looking out the window every few minutes to see if the figure was still there, which they were. By now it was 12:15 in the morning and they still hadn't moved. Internally, I was thinking about who this person could be and what reason they'd have to do this. We're a friendly community, and we know pretty much all of our neighbors, though everyone mostly keeps to themselves. It was unlikely that anyone knew my parents weren't home and that I was alone. There were 2 vehicles parked in our driveway, mine and my mom's, as my parents had taken my stepdad's truck to travel in. As far as I knew, we didn't have any issues with anyone, which made this scenario even more confusing and terrifying. It was 12:20 when things finally changed. As I was looking out the window for probably the 50th time that night, I saw the figure move. I froze, not moving a muscle, as I watched them turn and walk back the way I assumed they'd come, to the left, where they disappeared behind the barn, presumably back into the forest. My relief was only temporary, because while they were gone out of my vision, they could still very well be on my property, just hiding out in the trees. The feeling of being watched was gone, though, which made me feel a little bit better, though not by much. I decided to pull an all-nighter and stayed up until the sun rose, and then passed out on the couch. I woke up around 1 p.m. and had a moment where I thought I'd dreamt the whole thing. Just in case, after I finished my chores, I made my way across the field behind the animal pens to our property line, and walked from one end to the other to where the figure would have disappeared behind the barn, to see if I could find anything out of the ordinary. It had been dry for the past week, so the grass and dirt didn't show any footprints or any sign anyone had been there at all, which made me suspect that maybe I had imagined the whole thing. I have a history of being paranoid because of my anxiety, and I've had multiple nervous breakdowns over things that turned out to be inconsequential. Still, I couldn't just forget about the feeling that I'd gotten in the hot tub that night. The unmistakable feeling of having someone's eyes on me and not being able to tell who. To this day, I have no idea who it could have been. And to be honest, I don't really want to. Nothing like that has happened since, and I'm hoping it stays that way. To the figure that stood at the edge of my parents' property and watched me in the hot tub in the middle of the night, let's not meet. Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. If you have a true scary story of any nature that you'd like to hear narrated on this channel or my podcast, email it to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. If you would be so kind, take a minute to like this video and subscribe to my channel, and hit the notification bell for every time that I upload. Follow me on social media, links to that are in the description, and if you'd like to take your support of the channel even further, find a link to my Patreon page, as well as my storefront at tpublic.com. Both links are in the description. Everyone, be excellent to each other, and until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything: a ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.